During World War II, railways across the world were mobilised to play a vital part in the war effort. Australia's railways were mobilised too, but a network that should have been the nation's greatest asset couldn't cope. 6 different state railways, all running on different gauges, made freight handling at border crossings a circus.
The rails of the clown in this circus ring, tumbling, juggling, dropping the freight, but we're not laughing. Not when Australia's fate is in the balance. Just turn back to 42. Remember? A division of men and equipment bundled into anything on wheels crawled across the flat, bare belly of Australia. Change of gauge clogged up their effort. But all the time, the Japs were coming closer.
When the Americans came here, they looked and they said, well, you've got 2 lines, buddy. Why not 1 line to get it through from one city to the other, one state to the other? Well, General MacArthur, when he came through and stayed at the Globe Hotel, said, say, buddy, he said, this is going to help the enemy.
It took World War II to force Australia to recognise its break of gauge problems. Yet their origins could be traced all the way back to the dawn of the railway age. A land the size of the USA, with a population of less than 1 million Europeans. That was Australia in the 1840s. 3/4 of the continent remained unknown, unmapped and unexplored. Outback meant anywhere more than 100 kilometres from a coastal city. To go outback meant an arduous, back-breaking trek. Such inland settlements as there were existed only to grow wool. Sending wool to the coast by bullock dray might take a month, but wool was so valuable that it paid its way. Paddle steamers would soon be plying the inland rivers. Their main cargo would also be wool, the one crop that didn't perish on the slow trip downstream. Every colony wanted more development, but without better transport, the inland seemed destined to remain a sheep run. Australians knew about railways. In Britain, before migrating, some had even ridden on trains like this. It's a replica of Robert Stephenson's rocket, the first successful steam locomotive ever built. By the 1840s, Australia's need for railways was obvious, but no one could see how to pay for them. Then suddenly, almost overnight, everything changed. In February 1851, Australia struck gold. The rush brought new settlers pouring into the country. Population doubled in less than a decade. Suddenly, Australia was rich, and the railway age was finally born. Australia wouldn't become a single nation until 1901. Meanwhile, 6 separate colonial governments would each set out to create a railway system to suit itself. If a colony thought of its neighbour at all, it was as a rival. And it was in that divided spirit that Australia started laying rails. Colonial opinion was equally divided on another great matter, the question of what kind of railway the country should have. At least one school of thought favoured horse-drawn trains. It was the wool growers who favoured draft horsepower. They argued that horses were cheaper than steam locomotives, yet could still haul their wool to town. Fortunately, the more far-sighted disagreed. Although Australia's first true railway was in fact just such a line. First opened in 1854, this South Australian railway once carried wool from river steamers to waiting clipper ships. Part of the track at Victor Harbour has been restored as a tourist railway. It's a unique reminder of the kind of trains that most of early Australia nearly had. Horses would never appear on mainline tracks, but they did serve nobly on some private timber and mining lines, even in the 20th century. Melbourne became the first Australian city to actually get up ahead of steam in September 1854. The engine wasn't much bigger than the old rocket. The railway was just 4 kilometres long. It linked Melbourne with her port, in gold rush days Australia's busiest, with Melbourne Australia's fastest growing city. It was a notable first for a city founded only 19 years before. Sydney's steam age began just 1 year later with this locomotive. At Sydney's Powerhouse Museum, Australia's oldest surviving engine attracts almost as much attention today as it did the first time it ran. In 1855, it hauled the first steam train in New South Wales, from Sydney to Parramatta. By then, Sydney had already scored a significant first of its own. A private company had been formed to build the line, but it went bankrupt. The government had to step in to complete the work. As a result, this train ran on the first public railway anywhere in the British Empire to be government-built and run. It was Sydney's first line that set Australia's future trend. Most of the few early private railways would be taken over, and by far the majority of tracks would be government-run from the start. Nor is it hard to see why. Australia's first trains appeared on a raw frontier, one so new and unexplored that the limits of settlement were often defined by the track itself. Railway builders were true pioneers. A railway was often the first road in a wilderness. For private investors, that made railways a very uncertain bet. The chance of profits lay too far in the future. In the long run, government ownership had another significant side effect. It meant that Australians would always see their trains as a community service, not as a paying business. But government commitment to railways brought benefits too. The giant task was attacked on a giant scale. The railways were to become Australia's biggest employer and rail transport its biggest industry. In a period of 80 years, 3,500 locomotives were built in railway workshops around Australia. By the 1930s, trains had fulfilled their promise. They had conquered distances that had held development back for 100 years. They had literally transformed a nation. Australia had laid over 40,000 kilometres of iron rails, ranking 7th in the world for length of track. Not bad going at a time when the country still had a population of only 6 million people. But even as the last rails were being laid, there were warning signs ahead. Motor vehicles were fast becoming part of the transport scene, even on the railway line itself. The arrival of the motor car might not have been such a threat if the vast railway network had already been paid for. But it hadn't. Not even government had the finance to build the tracks Australia needed. Most of the money had been borrowed from overseas. By 1930, those borrowings amounted to the incredible sum for the time of $500 million, representing half of all the funds Australia had ever borrowed overseas. As the Great Depression struck, repayments on those loans would almost bankrupt the country. Australia's railways are still paying off the debts of the past, at least part of which stems from a major miscalculation. Governments in 1890 believed that by 1990 Australia would parallel the American experience and would have a population of 150 million people. The reality is 1/10 of that. Moreover, most Australians still live close to the coast. Inland growth has never quite lived up to expectations. Even without the miscalculations, Australia's railway network was never the grand vision it could have been. As each of the 6 colonial governments laid tracks towards its borders, the main object was often to steal its neighbours' trade. Victoria's motive was exactly that when it first pushed a railway up to its northern border, the Murray River. The Murray had already played a vital role in the development of the outback. The river flows through eastern Australia's agricultural heartland. Providing a border between Victoria and New South Wales, reaching the sea in yet a third colony, South Australia, the Murray was already a riverboat highway before the railway came. Geographically, the Murray was a natural highway to the interior. Politically, the eastern colonies saw the river quite differently. It drained their trade downstream to South Australia. It was to cut this supply line off that Victoria's railways hurried towards the Murray River, reaching Echuca as early as 1864. The port of Echuca is a living memorial to a time when this was the busiest railhead anywhere on the river. The line ran right to the river's edge. It scooped up trade that would otherwise have vanished downstream. Once railways reached the river, the days of the paddle steamer were numbered. In time, the spread of rail would steal the trade of all the river towns. Morgan in South Australia did at least survive until the 1930s. Trains brought travellers and cargo from Adelaide. The boats took them on upstream, but it was typical of the contest between river and rail that paddle steamers could only survive where rail had yet to reach, or when time didn't matter. In 1883, New South Wales Railways also reached the Murray, the colony's southern border, and arrived with some pride, to judge by the grand architecture of Albury Station. In those days, Albury truly was a border station. Every passenger had to pass through customs. Until Federation in 1901, taxes were levied on all goods passing between the states. Even passengers' bags were searched for contraband. The opening of the Sydney to Melbourne line was marked by enthusiastic celebrations. It was, after all, the first time any two colonial railways had come together. If Sydney was a rather patronising father and Melbourne an unenthusiastic son, at least the link between the two cities was now complete. Well, it was almost complete, because in fact the two lines didn't really meet at all. For 30 years, New South Wales and Victoria had been laying their tracks to different gauges. New South Wales had laid all theirs on standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches. Victoria had laid all theirs at a width of 5 feet 3, the so-called broad gauge. Queensland had settled on a narrow gauge, followed by Western Australia, Tasmania and the Northern Territory. South Australia had built both broad and narrow gauge. At Albury, as at nearly every border station, the break of gauge meant no passenger could complete the journey without changing trains. The reason Albury came to have one of the longest and busiest platforms in the world. Being a major bottleneck at least kept Albury Station buzzing with life, as local historian Cliff Chamberlain remembers.
Well, it was chaotic, particularly those trains that were coming in around the midnight, and you can imagine hundreds and hundreds of people, because everybody that travelled in those days, before the days of 4-lane highways and aeroplanes, you travelled by train or you didn't travel at all. And changing over with little sleepy children from one train to the other, because everybody changed here. That was the signal that went out, everybody changed, Albury.
Albury, all change! What the hell? Wake the children.
Grab a luggage. Find the ticket.
Get a porter.
We're changing trains.
We're changing gauge. This is the border. This is the barrier between the states.
They won't be in your purse. I always keep them in this pocket.
Tried looking in your overcoat.
They won't be in my overcoat.
So it was chaos, and then you'd have another crowd that would be building up the platform to get to the refreshment rooms for bangers and mash. So this, I would reckon, without really knowing, that I would imagine that this railway station here at Albury was probably the biggest in Australia. That is outside Sydney and Melbourne.
I want to stay in this train. But we can't be in. Why? Because we have to change into another one. Why? Because this is as far as this one goes. Why? Because it wants a rest. I don't know. Come on. a suitcase.
No, they won't be in a suitcase. Always keep them in this pocket.
The chaos made Albury an ideal place for celebrity spotting too.
I can remember Billy Hughes being here. Billy Hughes was a Prime Minister that was the caricature artist's favourite, and I've seen him here on a number of occasions. And you'd come up here, you'd see nuns in unusual habit. You'd see people from different lands in the days when we were a white Australian. We didn't see people from other lands. So Albury was the place, the Albury railway station, was the place where you saw the other side of the world. It's very sad to see the station that is so quiet, you know, so few people travelling now, because, you know, most people have got cars, we've got magnificent roads, highways. It's only 3 hours to Melbourne now. And it is a pity, because it was an era, it was more of a romantic era, I think.
Nostalgia adds romance to the past, but the enforced change of trains was at least inconvenient for passengers and a disaster for freight. Every item of freight had to be unloaded and transshipped to cross the border, as railwayman Jeff Hamilton remembers well.
It was a big operation. There was up to about 1,000 men operated over a period of quite a number of years, and through the war. They transshipped everything that you could possibly think of, because there was no transports. Every possible thing in the way of farm machinery, which were done on the 2 cranes, operated 24 hours a day. Fruit from Brisbane markets down to the Melbourne markets. Every possible thing that you could think, I think, was transshipped here, and everything had to be checked with a checker on a checking sheet to make sure that there was no shortages existing from Station A to Station B.
It finally took the dark days of World War II to prove that the situation was dangerous as well as confusing. Even then, it was another 17 years before the problem was finally fixed, at least on this line. In 1962, the Southern Aurora, the first standard gauge train, ran between Sydney and Melbourne, a real cause for celebration. Goods traffic doubled almost overnight, but even today, the gauge trouble isn't over. Although Sydney-Melbourne trains pass straight through Albury, freight bound for most other places in either state still has to be transshipped. For most freight, the method used is the bogie exchange, a complete change of wheels. It's quicker to change the wheels than to unload the car. It's a costly and time-consuming way for a freight train to cross a border. Similar operations slow things down all over Australia, and all because of a minimal difference in track width. A tiny gap that has become a gulf. Born amid the rivalry of the colonial age, broken gauges have bedevilled Australia's railways ever since, and the problem has become harder, not easier to solve. It's not just a question of broken gauges. Declining revenue has left Australia's railways with a whole infrastructure designed for a different age. It's no wonder that the railways are caught in a time warp. trapped somewhere between a museum piece of the past and a transport system of the future. Against the odds, Australia's railways are fighting back. It's even possible that their best years are still to come. But to succeed, they will need a truly national vision, the one vital quality that colonial railway builders lacked.